Have you ever wondered why some relationships, despite their promise, leave you feeling drained and confused? The question arrives like a quiet accusation, and in that silence a pattern often reveals itself. One person reflects a mirror that is not meant to show the whole self. In archetypal terms, the sovereign queen encounters a man whose presence demands an offering of identity, not of love. He is not merely unkind or distant. He uses projection as currency, casting his own unmet needs, fears, and inflated self-image onto the woman who most wants to see herself reflected whole. The mechanics are simple and ancient. Ego projection is when one's unstable self refuses internal integration and instead offloads pieces onto another. The projected shadow becomes a scaffolding for control. She is entrusted with qualities he rejects, and because she feels compassion and responsibility, she attempts integration on his behalf. This is where empathy becomes a vulnerability rather than a virtue. The empath carries not only her own interior weather but also another's storm, and the storm is presented as truth until her compass spins and she doubts her bearings. Observe how this cycle escalates into choreography. The narcissist rewards submission with intermittent validation, a pattern that trains the empath to seek safety in his approval. The woman who once trusted her senses is taught to renegotiate reality in small acts of concession. Gaslighting slips in not as a dramatic performance but as a pragmatic tactic. Question, then deny. Offer warmth, then withdraw. Praise, then reduce. Each contradiction is a small fracture. Jung called this the dance of projection and counterprojection. Two psyches misaligned, one refusing the labor of inner work, the other performing the unpaid labor of integration. Yet this is not moral condemnation. It is an anatomical description. Stoic insight can be grafted onto Jungian depth. The only true control lies in what is within the gates of consciousness. When the sovereign queen recognizes that her emotional economy has been subsidizing another's shadow, something essential shifts. But recognition is slow because projection wears the uniform of intimacy. The empath mistakes intensity for authenticity, believing the very energy that erodes her is proof of connection. Meanwhile, the narcissist's inner emptiness is not visible as lack. It appears as demand. The space where mutual vulnerability should sit becomes a theater of possession. Consider the small rituals that sustain the cycle. A late text that requires immediate explanation, a compliment followed by a private slight, an apologetic phrase that never translates into changed behavior. These are not random. They are tactical calibrations designed to keep the empath searching for lost equilibrium. Attachment wounds are exploited. The anxious partner leans forward, offering solutions, soothing, reassurance. The avoidant or grandiose partner learns to accept care without reciprocal interior work. Over time, the empath's boundaries blur because caregiving feels like sovereignty, and sacrifice masquerades as devotion. Now picture a symbol that will follow this narrative like a silent witness, a cracked mirror in a locked garden. The mirror promises reflection, but its fractures rearrange what is seen. The garden is walled, beautiful and tended, to the outside eye perfect. Inside, the woman polishes the mirror until exhaustion, convinced the image will one day return whole. The mirror is the open loop that will be answered later. Who broke it, and does mending it require leaving the garden or learning to see through the fissures? That question will not be satisfied here. It will be the compass that guides the work to come. Listen carefully to the psychology beneath the gestures. Projection is not always cruel. It can be unconscious, a desperate strategy to survive one's own disintegration. The empath, whose nervous system registers threat as obligation, mistakes caretaking for strength. The sovereign queen in myth acts from a place of centeredness and law, In life, she is often tempted to legislate another's soul. Understanding these mythic forces clarifies why leaving feels like betrayal and staying feels like duty. The edge of decision is therefore not merely relational, it is existential. Now the reality becomes clearer. Awareness is the first necessary wound that leads toward healing. Naming the pattern, ego projection, shadow acting out, attachment exploitation, does not fix the damage, but it relocates power. When the woman learns that the mirror has been altered, she can stop polishing and begin to examine the glass itself. The next act will ask what work looks like when the labor is returned to its rightful owner, and whether boundaries can be built without fury, only with quiet, relentless clarity. The garden's walls are not only physical, they are psychic boundaries drawn early in life, thinly gilded and presented as safety. In the archetype, the sovereign queen's court sometimes becomes a court of caretaking, where rulings are given for others' inner laws. The empath learns to rule by tending another's chaos, interpreting moods like weather reports and responding as if the forecast can be changed. This gives the narcissist a merciful mirror, a reflection that answers, consoles, and repairs without asking for the labor of self-repair. Projection thrives where accountability is absent. The dynamics feel faded because they reenact ancestral patterns. A woman taught to prioritize harmony over her own limits will carry that instruction into adult intimacy. The man who refuses to own his shadow will unconsciously seek a partner willing to hold it. Jung called this the psychology of complementarity. The unconscious finds its counterpart and consolidates energy around a shared script. The script reads like a tragedy. One soul exhausted by empathy, the other spared the work of interiorization. The sovereign queen becomes a caretaker by default, and then wonders how the crown came to feel like a burden. This is where language becomes a weapon and a salve. Words like always and never turn into verdicts that seal the empath into a role. A gentle correction from the narcissist is recast as personal failure. The empath apologizes for feelings that are legitimate. Emotional labor becomes a currency paid in silence. Stoic practice advises distinction between what is within and what is without, but the empath's nervous system has been trained to accept another's internal state as corresponsibility. The challenge is to reassign responsibility without collapsing into coldness. Boundaries are often imagined as walls. They are instead thresholds. A threshold distinguishes where one psyche ends and another begins without annihilating connection. The sovereign queen learns to hold a threshold with the same dignity used to command a throne. This means saying no without spectacle, withdrawing presence when safety is violated, and refusing to answer invitations into gaslit narratives. It means converting caretaking from compulsive rescue into deliberate support. The distinction is subtle, but it is the axis on which the cycle can be altered. Consider practical forms this looks like. Naming a feeling without apologizing for it, refusing to explain an emotion's legitimacy in the face of denial, and keeping small promises to oneself. These are architectural choices that redirect psychic energy back into the woman's life. When the empath stops subsidizing another's shadow, the narcissist's tactics lose efficiency. The intermittent reinforcement that once trained anxious attachment begins to tumble when responses are consistent and unshakable. The labor of inner work, once absent, becomes visible by its absence. Yet confrontation is inevitable and often dangerous to the comfort of sameness. The narcissist will escalate when the pattern is threatened, because the projected role is being reclaimed. Rage, devaluation, and performative victimhood are common tactics. Archetypally, the dragon awakens when the princess refuses the script. The woman must be prepared not only for her own fear, but for the turbulence that arrives when a long-standing economy of attention is dismantled. Stoic fortitude helps, Observe the storm, remember that outer chaos is not command, and choose action aligned with integrity. One tactical move in the work is the slow reintroduction of the mirror on different terms. Rather than smashing it, the sovereign queen inspects the crack, learns its pattern, and chooses whether to place a new pane or to view herself without it. This is not metaphor alone. It describes reworking relational feedback loops. The empath who becomes the sentinel asks for specific changes and names the consequences for repeated harms. The change is not manipulation, it is clarity. It offers the narcissist an honest choice: engage in mutual repair or be witnessed as unwilling. Now consider repair that does not involve reconciliation. Sometimes the cracked mirror is evidence that the garden must be left. Leaving is not failure. It is a restoration of the boundary between self and projection. The narrative insists leaving will be dramatic, but more often it is quiet. A packed box, a final conversation that is short and factual, a refusal to be drawn into pity plays. The woman who leaves does not announce conquest. She reclaims atmosphere. The sovereignty in departure is not meant to punish. It is meant to recalibrate where life is possible. The work is not finished when distance is established. Integration asks for shadow work inside, where the empath examines why care became obligation and how self-worth was exchanged for validation. Jungian individuation requires sitting with the parts that once longed to rescue. Stoic practice offers stern, steady exercises. Name what is controllable, practice small acts of consent to oneself, and hold the line between empathy and engulfment. The sovereign queen learns to sit with discomfort without repairing it for another. She learns that calm is a practice, not a reward. But what if the garden could be tended differently? The question lingers like a spark in the dark. What if the garden could be tended differently, not as a prison of projections, but as a sanctuary of sovereignty? To understand this possibility, the cycle must be traced to its deepest roots. Projection is not random. It is the unconscious searching for a container. The narcissist's ego, fragile and brittle, cannot hold contradiction. The empath's openness, deep and porous, becomes the vessel. One fears fragmentation, the other fears abandonment. The bond is forged in the alchemy of fear, not love. In Jungian terms, this is the collision of shadow and anima. The man rejects his flaws, casting them outward, while clinging to an inflated self-image. The woman absorbs what is expelled, mistaking it for intimacy. In myth, this dynamic appears as the devouring sorcerer and the sacrificing maiden. One consumes vitality, the other believes endurance is proof of devotion. The tragedy is that both remain uninitiated into their full selves. Individuation halts because each clings to a half-truth. He avoids shadow, she avoids solitude. Together they avoid wholeness. When awareness emerges, the empath confronts a painful paradox. She was never truly seen. The adoration, the idealization, the pedestal, none of it was about her essence. She was a canvas painted with projections, a mirror reflecting an ego that could not self-sustain. This realization feels like grief because it dismantles the fantasy of unique connection. The sovereign queen must mourn the loss of an illusion before she can step into her throne. And mourning is necessary. Grief is the fire that clears the underbrush so the forest can regrow. The work of transformation is not glamorous. It involves uncomfortable silence, moments of doubt, and the ache of detachment. The empath's nervous system, once wired to anticipate his moods, must relearn neutrality. This is why no contact or low contact becomes more than a boundary. It becomes nervous system rehab. Without the constant drip of projection, she can feel her own pulse again. Stoic wisdom enters here. Do not tie your peace to what belongs to another. If another's chaos dictates your calm, sovereignty is compromised. Peace must be cultivated from within. Patterns resist disruption. The narcissist may attempt to reclaim his projection vessel through hoovering, sudden apologies, declarations of love, promises of change. These are not always lies. Sometimes they are desperate attempts to avoid facing the abyss within. But sincerity without inner work is hollow. The empath must recognize this. Words without sustained action are theater. The sovereign queen holds court by insisting on evidence, not promises. She understands that mercy without discernment becomes complicity. She learns to say, "Show me, not tell me." The archetypal shift comes when the empath reclaims projection. Instead of carrying his shadow, she faces her own. Why did she need to rescue? Why did self-worth become tethered to his approval? This is the turning point. Jung taught that what we repress becomes fate. If she represses her fear of being unchosen, she will choose men who never truly choose her. If she represses her anger, she will attract those who ignite it. Shadow work asks her to own the parts she hid from herself, to gather them like exiled children, and to integrate them into her sovereignty. This is not cruelty, it is liberation. When she ceases to be the vessel of another's projections, she discovers that her empathy is not meant to be squandered but directed. She can extend compassion without surrendering identity. She can discern when care becomes caretaking, when patience becomes self-erasure. This discernment is the crown of the sovereign queen. In myth, the crown is not ornamental. It is heavy, forged in fire, and demands strength to wear. Her crown is boundary, her throne is self-respect, her scepter is truth. The cracked mirror returns here, still waiting in the garden. Its fissures no longer distort her reflection. They remind her that wholeness does not require perfection. She does not polish the cracks away. She learns to see herself through them, to love the image as it is. The mirror becomes not a prison but a testament, broken yet reflecting. The garden once walled can now open a gate. She need not remain trapped. She may choose to walk beyond. And if she stays, she does so as sovereign, not servant. The ascent is not yet complete, but the path is visible. The empath who became the sovereign queen begins to understand that projection, once her burden, can no longer enslave her. Now she stands before the choice: repeat the cycle or step beyond it into freedom. Which path will she choose? The confrontation sharpens like a blade honed by patient hands. In the arena of Rhea, change, rhetoric falls away and only habits remain. The narcissist's tactics will escalate because systems defend themselves. Expect triangulation, gaslighted memories, and sudden moral outrage framed as self-preservation. The sovereign queen meets this not with dramatics but with measures. Clear limits spoken once, predictable consequences, and an unornamented refusal to re-enter chaotic narratives. Discipline here is not punishment. It is the education of a nervous system. Begin with small, repeatable actions: sleep, meals, a daily truth journal where feelings are named and not negotiated. Each small ritual reprograms the autopilot that once defaulted to over-rescue. When the empath chooses a quiet boundary, the world does not shatter. Only the pattern that required her surrender does, and the tremor reveals what must be rebuilt. Language is a tool that can be reclaimed. Replace pleading explanations with declarative sentences. Name the behavior, state the impact, and define the consequence. If the narcissist invalidates memory, say, "This is what happened. This is how it affected me. This is what will happen next." Keep the syllables plain and the cadence steady. Drama is the old currency and calm is the new economy. By demanding evidence rather than theatrical vows, the sovereign queen refuses to be wooed back into unpaid caretaking. When escalation arrives, prepare for projection flips and blame inversions. The mirror will be held up as proof that the empath is the offender. This is a predictable defensive maneuver and can be met with a structured response. Disengage, document, and consult a trusted witness or therapist when needed. Witnesses matter because projection often creates parallel realities. A boundary held in private can be denied in public. A boundary witnessed is harder to erase. Do not confuse compassion with availability. Compassion is a decision made from abundance. Availability is a habit born of scarcity. The empath must practice selective generosity, help when asked and when capacity exists, not as an automatic tax paid to soothe another's anxiety. This recalibration preserves the emotional currency that once drained life from other pursuits, relationships with friends, creative work, or the simple pleasure of uninterrupted thought. Practical scaffolding supports psychological work. Create a list of non-negotiables and post it where it is seen daily: sleep quality, truthful communication, physical safety, and respect for time. Practice scripts aloud. When you do X, I will do Y, spoken without apology or embellishment. Rehearsal trains speech muscles that have atrophied from years of self-suppression. Stoic practice complements this. Pause before reacting, test the impulse for truth, and choose the response that matches values rather than fear. Interdependence is the destination, not isolation. The goal is not to become invulnerable, but to form relationships where vulnerability is mutual and repair is reciprocal. Seek alliances that model healthy attachment, friends and mentors who reflect fair reciprocation. Use community as a mirror that shows how autonomy and connection can coexist, because culture often mistakes attachment for enslavement and independence for coldness. Shadow work deepens when shame is met with curiosity rather than contempt. Ask, which parts of self were sacrificed to keep another whole? Which needs were outsourced to avoid conflict? Explore these questions with a therapist, a journal, or a trusted friend who can hold accountability without reenacting projection. Integration is slow. It demands witnessing, naming, and tending the inner children who once became caretakers by default. There will be relapse. The mind prefers the familiar even when familiar hurts. Prepare for nights when doubt returns and the old scripts replay. Have a plan, a breathing sequence, a short walk, a call to a trustworthy ally, or reading a paragraph that reminds the sovereign queen of her commitments. The routine of returning to self is not weakness. It is training. Consistency is the crucible that forges new habit into identity. The garden that once felt like confinement can become a place of choice. Whether the gate opens outward to new life or remains closed as a curated sanctuary, the decision is now owned rather than borrowed. The mirror may still bear cracks, but the woman who stands before it has learned to read the fractures and knows which reflections are hers and which were given to her by another's shadow. The final question that lingers like a key at the center of the story is simple and refuses to be satisfied by wishful thinking. Will the sovereign queen repair the mirror herself, or will she walk beyond the garden and never return to the polishing again? The rebuilding begins not with grand declarations, but with small, repeated fidelity to self. Rituals are the architecture of inner life. A morning that honors appetite and rest, a calendar that protects hours once. Endeared, a simple habit of naming unmet needs without apology. These acts are not cosmetic. They retrain the autonomic nervous system that was conditioned to respond to another's modulation. Stoic practice meets Jungian depth here. Discipline reorders the day, and depth work gathers what was scattered into a cohesive interior. Over time, repetition becomes habit, habit becomes identity, and identity becomes the new field on which relationships meet. Emotional literacy is the toolkit of sovereignty. Learn the language of affect, label sensations, trace their narratives, and distinguish between feeling and duty. When a surge of anxiety arrives, map it. Where in the body does it live? What story accompanies it? Which voice from the past echoes in its tone? This mapping is not therapy on a page. It is a return to agency. Naming weakens the power of projection because projections are sustained by unnamed fears and unexamined obligations. The sovereign queen transforms confusion into a text she can read and edit. Embodiment matters because the body remembers truths the mind forgets. Somatic practices, slow walks, attention to breath, mindful touch of one's own wrist, reconnect sensation with intention. The empath who once lived in the mind as a strategy against pain now learns to inhabit the body as a home. Sensuality is reclaimed not as seduction for another but as communion with presence. The taste of food, the warmth of sunlight, the firmness of a handshake that conveys reciprocity. These are small rebellions against a life lived in the service of someone else's inner weather. Relational reskilling is necessary. Freedom requires literacy in new patterns. Practice asking clearly, listening for reciprocity, and calibrating expectations to evidence. A request that is met once and not met again must be demarcated with a consequence that is predictable and humane. This is not vengeance. It is a grammar of safety. Use allies to rehearse difficult conversations and solicit feedback that does not replay the old scripts. Community provides a mirror that does not distort projections, but reflects capacity and boundary with clarity. The shadow still lives and will test the work through temptation and nostalgia. There will be moments when the voice that once sought to mend another returns with softened cadence, and puppets of memory will recite the best scenes from an abusive play. In these moments, the practice is to interrogate the memory. Ask what was real, what was projected, and what was omitted. Grief must be allowed. The heart does not trade pain for wisdom without cost, but grief without action becomes a shrine. The sovereign queen honors sorrow and converts it into a map for the next choice. Financial and logistical autonomy often follows psychological sovereignty because boundaries demand practical backup. Create a plan that honors independence, a savings ritual, trusted contacts for emergency support, and clear logistical steps for transitions if necessary. Autonomy is rarely purely emotional. It is woven through practical capacities that make choices possible. Building this infrastructure does not mean preparing for inevitable separation. It means ensuring that decisions can be made from power rather than panic. Forgiveness may come but on new terms. Forgiveness is not erasure nor an invitation to return to old patterns. It is the last act of sovereignty when it happens, an intentional release that does not require reconciliation. The sovereign queen forgives to unbind her hands, not to lend them to an abuser again. This kind of forgiveness is an inner contract that preserves dignity and refuses to barter it for the comfort of nostalgia. It is a quiet, sovereign ceremony that completes a stage of the work. The cracked mirror is no longer a weapon nor a promise. It is a teacher. Some pieces will be fitted back together with effort and tenderness, others left as testimony of survival. The garden's gate opens when choice is available, not coerced. The question that opened the loop now returns with new gravity. Who broke the mirror and who will take responsibility for the shards? The answer will reveal itself in the final stage of the journey, whether by mending, by walking away, or by building a different reflection altogether. The final labor of integration is not heroic noise. It is steady, quiet reclamation. In the aftermath of projection, the sovereign queen cultivates a rhythm where promises to self are honored before promises to others, and small consistencies become the scaffolding of a new life. The archetype teaches that inner law precedes outer command. When obligation shifts inward, external relationships realign. The empath learns to measure value by internal metrics rather than by another's unpredictable applause. Trust rebuilds slowly because the nervous system remembers betrayal longer than the mind remembers explanation. Practice becomes the soil where new trust can take root. Consistent wake times, truth. Speech, an insistence on reciprocity for sustained intimacy. When those basic structures are honored, the nervous system can down-regulate and stop scanning for the next betrayal. This biochemical calm is not indulgence. It is preparation for relationships that do not require constant rescue. Boundaries are not invented in moments of crisis. They are rehearsed in ordinary days. Name the line, state the consequence, and follow through with the same quiet certainty afforded to a tax due date or a work deadline. The sovereign queen's economy of attention is finite. Spend it where mutuality and repair exist. Withhold it where projection is extant. Over time, this discipline rewrites the relational ledger so that generosity is chosen, not coerced. Somatic presence anchors psychological change to the body where long-term trauma usually resides. Slow breathing, simple movement, and attention to sensation translate intellectual insights into lived safety. The body remembers what the mind forgets and will report the truth of boundaries long before rational arguments are made. Attend to those reports and treat them as counsel, not as embarrassment. Community is the crucible where new patterns either survive or dissolve. Seek mirrors that reflect back capacity, not sympathy, mentors who model reciprocity, friends who hold memory as witness rather than as judge. The sovereign queen learns to distribute care outward in a network that demonstrates the difference between interdependence and enmeshment. This redistribution reduces the pressure on any single relationship to contain another's shadow. Forgiveness and militant self-love are not opposites. They are companions that walk different corridors of the same palace. Forgiveness releases, sovereignty secures, and both require a rock-solid interior loyalty to self. The final choice must be made from the seat of that loyalty, to repair where mutual work is evident, or to walk beyond the garden with dignity preserved, which will be chosen when the mirror finally demands an answer. The culmination of this work is less a dramatic act and more an unhurried mastery of daily allegiance to self. The sovereign queen does not arrive by a single triumphant exit. She is forged in 1,000 small refusals and tenacious yeses to what matters. Each refusal to be guilted back into caretaking is recorded as a quiet victory. Each insistence on honest exchange is a stone laid in a new foundation. Over time, the ledger of lived choices realigns the heart's expectations and the body's default settings. When the cracked mirror is finally examined with sober hands, its history reads like a map, not an indictment. The shards name where projection landed, and the patterns around those impacts reveal old contracts that were never truly consented to. The sovereign queen examines which promises were borrowed, which obligations were inherited, and which loyalties belong to her alone. This inventory is not morbid, it is clarifying. It illuminates exactly what must be returned to its rightful owner, and what must be integrated into a renewed self. Repair, if it is chosen, requires two currencies, evidence and repetition. Apologies are insufficient without changed practice. Vows must be accompanied by altered behavior day after day. The narcissist who seeks repair must learn to hold contradiction within himself, to sit with discomfort without shifting it outward as accusation or seduction. This is difficult work and will tax the most resistant parts, but it is the only currency the sovereign queen will accept because truth without endurance is a hollow theater. If repair is impossible, departure is not a rupture but a reallocation of life force. Walking away without spectacle honors the dignity of the self that has been catalogued and defended. Departure need not be dramatic. It can be the patient unhooking from patterns that no longer serve. The woman who leaves does so after careful inventory, financial, logistical, emotional, and without the frantic hope that the other will change in her absence. She leaves because sovereignty is no longer negotiable. Future pacing is not a fantasy. It is a rehearsal for habit. Imagine mornings where nervous scanning has been replaced by a steady breath and a calendar that respects energy. Imagine conversations where requests are met with reciprocity or with neutral consequence rather than with emotional debt. Imagine nights where sleep arrives without the knot of anticipatory repair in the chest. These are not distant dreams. They are the likely outcomes when small choices accumulate into a life designed by the woman who values herself. Community continues to matter. The sovereign queen does not become solitary by accident. She chooses companions who reflect reciprocity. Friends, mentors, and therapists become the scaffold that sustains new habit until it is self-sustaining. Their presence functions as regular calibration, mirrors that do not distort, witnesses who remember and who refuse to return the woman to old economies. This is how interdependence differs from enmeshment, by mutual accountability, not unilateral absorption. There will be days when grief returns with the clarity of a bell, when the fantasy of what could have been rings loud and the body forgets the reason for the boundary. In those moments, practice the small kit, a named breath, a factual journal entry, a call to an ally who keeps memory honest. Grief allowed to move becomes compost for growth. Grief held as a shrine becomes a trap. The sovereign queen honors sorrow without letting it reroute her future. The final integration is an ethics of attention. Where attention goes, life follows. Choose to invest it in pursuits that nurture presence, in people who answer, and in work that reveres limits. The woman who once held someone else's shadow discovers that the light reclaimed for herself is not lonely. It invites new forms of intimacy, ones that are reciprocal, repairable, and alive. This is the promise that Jungian individuation and Stoic discipline converge upon, a self that is whole enough to meet others without being consumed. Share the moment you finally said, "Enough," and reclaimed your power in the comments below. The woman who sees the truth chooses her peace.